大家好，我是 World TV 的舒子晨，今天很有幸能够跟 Barry Link 做一下 Vancouver Courier News。
My name is Barry Link, and I'm the editor of the Vancouver Courier, a twice-weekly newspaper here in Vancouver, BC. We've worked on a lot of stories this week, including an interesting meeting of the Kitsilano Community Centre Association, continuing coverage on the provincial election, and also a sailing team from Vancouver that hopes to go to the Olympics. First up, we'll start with the Community Centre Association meeting. Here are some of the top news stories that we covered in Vancouver this week. First of all, we have reporter Sandra Thomas, who wrote about a very interesting meeting of the Kitsilano Community Centre. First question, Sandra, what was so unusual about this meeting?
Well, what was so unusual about the meeting is that annual general meetings of community centres typically don't make the news, but this one is indicative of the ongoing conflict between some community centre associations and the Vancouver Park Board over the joint operating agreement.
Can you tell us a little bit about the joint operating agreement?
Would see services centralised, but the most contentious point is that the Park Board wants to pool all of the resources from all of the community centre associations and then redistribute them between the have and have not community centres.
Now, one of the unusual circumstances surrounding the meeting was that Park Board staff, especially senior management staff, showed up to the meeting. Is that unusual?
It's usual for a commissioner to show up to a meeting because they're the liaison to that community centre association. But what's very unusual in this case is a general manager of the Park Board and a senior staff member.
Final question, Sandra. The upshot of the meeting was that there was a slate of people that ran against the existing board, but they did not get elected. But they did try. How did that turn out for them?
Well, what happened was this group of citizens, just residents, who wanted to join the board. Prior to that, there had been rumors that there was going to be these radicals were going to show up, throw the old board out, take over everything. They, again, are concerned about this joint operating agreement, which is at the center of all of the drama that's going on right now with the Vancouver Park Board. But none of them were elected. The original board remained, and they were unsuccessful in attempting to get onto the board.
So a more interesting Community Centre Association AGM than you normally see in Vancouver.
Absolutely. Typically, I wouldn't cover them because they're just not that interesting. This one had lots of interest, lots of drama, and I think we're going to see more of this in the future.
Fascinating. Thank you, Sandra. With me now is Andrew Fleming, a reporter for the Vancouver Courier, who's been covering the provincial election. So, Andrew, there are 11 ridings in the Vancouver area up for grabs in this election. And of the governing BC Liberal Party, 3 candidates or 3 sitting MLAs decided not to run again. What does that say?
Well, the optics aren't great. So you've got 3 incumbent MLAs who chose not to run again. Now, one of them is probably retirement age, Mary McNeil. She chose not to run again. But 2 of those, Cash Heed, who had a pretty scandal-plagued term, and Colin Hanson, of course, is one of the architects of the HST. So if you believe the polls, it's probably going to be an NDP landslide the next election, but I don't know if you can always agree with the polls. I mean, the Alberta election, they're saying there's going to be a wild rose. They were going to win everything, and of course they didn't. So the advance polls are saying an NDP victory, but you never know. It could change.
Of course, you won't know until May 14th when when voters of BC actually cast their ballots. Now, speaking of the NDP, they nominated their candidates in Vancouver very early on. What does that say about the NDP and perhaps their level of confidence in this election?
Well, they had a lot of time to prepare. They knew this was coming. Of course, I mean, everybody knew an election was coming, but they had a lot of time to gather their horses. I do think it's significant that so many Liberal candidates were only announced at the very last minute. It really, again, the optics seem to suggest that they couldn't find people who were willing to run for the party, and for a ruling party, I would say that's significant. I think there's 3 candidates who were announced within the past week, all announced their candidacy, or the last week, sorry, before the writ dropped. One the day of, and I think it doesn't really inspire a lot of confidence for voters, but again, things could change if they have a strong showing in all candidates' debates.
Now, it's not just the Liberals and the NDP, of course, that are running. There are other parties, notably the BC Conservatives and the Green Party. How many candidates do they have running in Vancouver?
Well, it's funny you should ask that, because if you asked me this yesterday, the Conservatives only would have had 2 after firing one of their candidates for Twitter comments from about a year ago. But since then, they've grown to 7 since this morning, so I have to update that story. One of them is even a former MP, a federal MP. So they found a lot of people. Today, of course, is the last day that candidates can be declared. It's 10 days after the writ drop day. But they now have 7 candidates in 11 ridings, and who knows, the day is still young.
And what about the Green Party?
Green have 11 candidates in all of their ridings, and they have for quite some time. There are some candidates with some name recognition. I personally don't think the Greens have much of a chance of winning any ridings here, although apparently they're doing quite well in Vancouver Island. There's some ridings that might go Green, which would be a first, I believe. You've got some with some name recognition. You've got Stuart McKinnon. He's a former park board person. You've got Jodie Emery, a perennial candidate, who was, of course, Mark Emery's wife, the marijuana activist. But I think realistically, I can't see a Green candidate being elected.
Now, of the races that we have, of course, as you said, there's 11 ridings in Vancouver. What would be the 2 or 3 election races to watch in Vancouver?
Well, I'd say Point Grey is by far the most interesting. I mean, Christy Clark, she only narrowly squeaked by David Eby in the by-election after Gordon Campbell stepped down. I mean, this is a traditionally very liberal, very wealthy stronghold, if you will, and the fact that it was close the last time, I think, speaks to a huge dissatisfaction of the Liberal Party. She's had a couple of years to win people over, so it'll either be close again or it won't be close at all. I find that difficult to say. And I think the False Creek riding is one of the more interesting ones as well. You've got Sam Sullivan, a former mayor of Vancouver, running against the NDP, I guess a bit of a dark horse candidate, really. He's a political newcomer, but I don't know. I think we might be seeing a bit more energy about surrounding the NDP again. And back to False Creek again, that's the same riding where the Conservative candidate, Ian Tootle, recently was kicked out for previous Twitter comments. You know, how this information was leaked. It takes quite a bit of time and energy to scroll back through some of these tweets from so long ago, and I smell the Liberals' fingerprints on this one, but there's no way to prove that.
Well, of course, everyone's trying to get the best advantage they can in any kind of political race. And the NDP actually had some trouble right out of the gate, but that wasn't a Vancouver candidate. That was someone in the interior.
That was in Kelowna, yeah. There's some woman who said some disparaging remarks about First Nations. And they keep saying French, too. I can never see the French ones. I don't know if they're deleted or not. But I think a lot of people make these comments on social media before they really intend to run. And your digital footprints can come back to haunt you. But I do think, I think in the case of Tootle, his comments were taken a little bit out of context, and at best he probably only would have got about 3% of the vote anyway, but he would have stolen some of the votes from, I would think, from the right wing. Anyway, that's as of now, there's seven Conservative candidates in the 11 ridings, and we'll see by the end of the day.
And of the other races to watch, perhaps the one with another former city politician, Susan Anton, running in a riding as well? Yes,
I believe that's Fraserview, Vancouver Fraserview. And Suzanne Anton, of course, she was a mayoral candidate 2 years ago here in Vancouver. She ran for the nomination in Vancouver Kilchenna, losing to Andrew Wilkinson. And some would say she's kind of parachuted into this new riding where she doesn't have a lot of history. She would argue that, as a park board or, as a former city councillor, that, she does have experience there, but she doesn't live there. And, well, we'll see. It was a close call in the last election. Gabriel Yu ran against Cash Heed, and there was some shenanigans, for lack of a better word, about campaign funding, and basically Cash Heed was eventually fined $8,000 for violating the elections law, but they did not trigger a by-election, so he's allowed to keep his seat. But I think Gabriel Yu is quite a strong contender in that. I think a lot of people, well, we'll see, but I think Gabriel Yu is going to be a tough opponent for her to beat.
And finally, the NDP opposition leader, Adrian Dix, is running in Vancouver. So yes. Vancouver has both the sitting premier and the opposition leader running in ridings in Vancouver. So it's an interesting situation for the city and for voters here. What is Dix facing in his riding?
Off the top of my head, I forget the name of his candidate.
That might say something right there, yeah.
She doesn't have a lot of name recognition. I think she is basically a sacrificial lamb they have to run somebody against him, obviously. I believe it's a woman. I've forgotten her name. I don't think she has a strong chance, but again, who knows? It could surprise us.
So the premier has a tough fight, and Adrian Dix probably will just walk in.
I'd say that's a fair assessment, yeah.
Andrew, thank you.
Thank you.
With me now we have Megan Stewart, who is the sports editor for the Vancouver Courier, and she's been covering an interesting situation with the Vancouver sailing team that hopes to get to the Olympics. And in your story, you described that they really like to train in English Bay. Why is that?
That's right. Zach Mesman and Daniel Franz Hernandez are two young sailors in their early 20s who became a team about a year ago. They used to be competitors, and now they're racing a very lightweight, very fast boat called a 49er. And they love the conditions in English Bay because they are extremely unpredictable, which means they have to be alert, they have to react, and when the conditions change, they have to be ready to maintain their competitive advantage because they're competitors and they want to win.
Now, you describe them as competitors. For people who don't sail, what are the requirements to be a sailor? Do they have to be strong? Do they have to be really physically fit?
They do. This kind of sailing is very physically demanding. Because the boat is so light, Daniel and Zach actually have to weigh 170 pounds each just to maintain ballast on the boat because they use their bodies to help steer and control the direction of the boat, along with the sails and the rudder.
So they can't be over 170 pounds or under 170?
They can't be under 170 pounds. So both of these young men are around 6 foot, and they go to the gym 5 days a week. They're eating 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day to maintain their weight.
That's a lot of food.
It's a lot of food because they're also exercising a lot out on the water. So they have to eat those calories to stay alive and then also to keep their weight up.
So when is their next race?
Their next race is actually in June at the Royal Vancouver Yacht Club, which is the club out of which both these young men sail. But because this is the start of the Olympic quadrennial, there are 3 main Olympic class or national type races this year. And the first one is going to be in Oregon. And then later in August in New York State, they actually will race at the American National Championships. So they can't be U.S. champions, but they will race against some of the best in the world.
And then what happens to them after that? How long do they continue to train for the next Olympics?
Right. The next Olympics are in 2016 in Rio, so they will be training until then. The first milestone they have to meet is their goal at least is in 2014 to make the Canadian national team. And then from there are different regattas, different races in which they will race to qualify for the Olympics.
And you mentioned Rio. In your story, going back to the first thing we talked about, they said the waters in the race course they expect in Rio will be relatively calm compared to English Bay here?
It's not that they're calm. The way Daniel Franz Hernandez explained it to me is he said in Rio the water there is light and shifty, so it's going to change a lot, which is why specifically they like training in English Bay because the conditions are so unpredictable. They have to be very alert.
So it's a team to watch as the next Olympics approaches.
It is a team to watch, especially because these guys have become friends, they have great camaraderie, and they have wonderful interaction between them. One thing to keep in mind with sailors is there's only 2 on the boat, and they have to work very closely together, so how they communicate is essential to how they perform.
They have to like each other.
They better like each other.
Well, we wish them the best. Megan, thank you.
Thank you.
感谢收看今天的大温故事，我们下期再见。